guess we're ready to kick off. One more time, thanks a lot for joining. We do appreciate that. Uh, so we will briefly introduce the professor that we have today, our guest in our so-called Revival Author Series. Evan Taylor is an associate professor of economics at the University of Arizona's Eller College. His work lies at the intersection of macroeconomics, migration, and applied econometrics, using big historical datasets and careful causal methods to answer policy relevant questions. His projects also include looking at how migrant networks influence where people settle, how improvements in schooling show up decades later, and how big internal moves change life paths. Quite interesting. About the agenda today, in the first part, we will ask you some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. In the second part, we will specifically focus on one of your research works, which is the impact of Great Migration on mortality of African Americans, evidence from the Deep South. And in the third part, there will be another specific research work of yours, which is the long-run health consequences of rural-urban migration. That's basically it. One more time, really nice to meet you, Professor. Hello.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Sure. I guess we will dive straight into the point with the part one. My first question would be about what first drew you to economics. Was there some open eyes moment for you when you realized that economics is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life?
So yeah, I really started in undergrad. When I started undergrad, I actually wanted to be a math major, and then I took some math classes, and I did okay, but I thought, this is kind of pretty abstract, and I think I really remember thinking that when I took like a topology course. I was like, this is super abstract. I'm not really sure if this is what I want to be doing. And then I'd also taken some economics courses, and it was kind of a nice blend for me because I always really liked math, but with economics, you can use math to sort of apply it to real world problems. And with an economics degree, I think you can do sort of almost anything. And so that that really drew me to economics as an undergrad. And so that's and then I switched to being an economics major, and I really liked all the classes I took, and thought this is super interesting. It's the study. It's really not the study of money. It's really the study of people. And so I was just always fascinated by that. And so it wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years after I graduated that I actually started my PhD. I kind of did some other things in between. So I wasn't sure at that point that I wanted to go that route, but so that's how I really got into economics.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. So my next question would be, how do you balance the demands of producing research works while also having equally big responsibility of teaching students at university? And here is another follow-up question. What is more important to you, like teaching the already known or exploring the unknown topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say teaching is one of my favorite parts of the job. It's really fun to sort of interact with students, especially the ones that are super interested in economics and really want to chat with you, not just during class, but after class. And so, most of my job is actually teaching the already known, or, there's lots of stuff in economics we sort of don't know for sure, but sort of think we know. And that's probably the bigger part of my job than finding actually, new breakthroughs. The research I do on migration and economic history is all, I think, very interesting. but I do think the sort of more important part of my job and the sort of longer impact stuff is going to be, teaching students, because that's going to be, the people that hopefully go on to do things in economics or wherever they go to do. And so in terms of time, I don't know. I've never really had too much trouble sort of balancing time between research and teaching. Both are time consuming for sure, but there's plenty of hours in the day.
Uh, sure. Thanks a lot. So my next question would be about your works. So your works blend economic history, labor, and health with careful causal methods. So what skills or habits let you move across these fields without getting shallow, superficial in anyone? And how did you deliberately build that toolkit?
Yeah, so I think big part of it was graduate school. Just sort of, I went to University of Michigan. I had great professors. I really learned a lot about how to, just like do research, like in terms of like managing, like little things like managing data sets, organizing files, and then in terms of doing across different fields. I think me personally, I sort of get bored if I just work on one specific field over and over again. There's only so many questions, I guess, that you can find. So I do like to work across sort of different things like economic history and labor, and then I also have some applied econometrics papers. You don't want to spread yourself too thin, especially for those of us that aren't writing 10 papers a year like Asimoglu or someone like that. But I do think it's good to sort of work in different fields, and you get ideas, I think, from different places. So in terms of coming up with new ideas, I think it's hard. For me, it's hard if I'm just working on sort of one field.
Uh-huh. Pretty interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. So, much of your research turns big social shifts into natural experiments that you conduct. So, could you describe a method that you use for spotting like credible design? What signals indicate that this is a causal gold relationship in economics and I have to study this? And what are red flags that make you walk away from this question?
Yeah, so I mean, coming up with good causal designs is probably the hardest thing, I think, in applied economics. It's there's not that many good instruments out there. There's not that many natural experiments. It's and then there's any causal design, I think, is never perfect. So we try to do the best we can in coming up with plausible instruments or exogenous variation. Even and I think a lot of good applied work is not even necessarily causal. Like I think we should be able to do research designs where causality is not 100% known. I think descriptive papers are super useful too, and I think a lot of the best papers just do a really careful job of analyzing the data and saying what the limitations are and saying this is maybe not totally identify a causal parameter, but we hopefully still learn something super interesting anyway. So I think in terms of what's a red flag for a causal design is always going to be context dependent. It's hard to pinpoint sort of one thing with a generality, but I don't think we necessarily need to have all our research be specifically causal, because there's I think we're just limiting ourselves too much if we're focusing 100% on we want to do everything everything we need, everything we do needs to be causal. I think we're limiting ourselves too much.
Thank you.
So my next question would be kind of personal and work related at the same time. So I also have that situation. So big papers can take years, and your motivation often shrinks over time. So
Yeah.
what do you do when a project like stalls, and do you change the question, change the data, change the team? And can you give like maybe one concrete example of what you did in
Yeah.
such situation?
This is a very concrete example for this question. So my original job market paper when I was graduating from University of Michigan was a paper on the impact of college education on mortality. So I used an instrument which is maybe not such a great instrument. It's basically how close your town of birth is to a college, and there are some problems with this instrument. But I went ahead anyway and wrote that paper, and I found actually that the impact of college on mortality sort of only mattered for men and not for women, if I remember correctly. But it turns out when I got more data, that the instrument, I got better data. I got data on this was using 1940 census data. I got data on people's parents' characteristics, like their mother's education and their father's occupation and things like that. Once you control for those things, actually the instrument just didn't work at all. So I had to sort of, the paper sort of stalled out, and I sort of had to switch directions and sort of switch that paper into actually looking at not just the impact of college education, but all levels of education on older age mortality. And so that's now, so this is a paper I started working on, I guess, like 10 years ago, and it's still a working paper. We're with two other co-authors at this point. And what we find is pretty interesting is actually that we know that there's a mortality education gradient. That people with higher levels of education live longer and live quite a bit longer. But we don't really know to what extent that relationship is causal, or what part of that relationship is just healthier people are more likely to go to college, more likely to get higher levels of education. So of course they live longer. What we do is we have a huge data set of basically everyone between the ages of 0 to 16 in 1940 in the 1940 census. And so we can see, there are a lot of things about their household, like their exact neighborhood, their father's income, father's occupation, household income, education of their parents, things like that. Turns out that when you control for all of those things, that the education mortality gradient doesn't change at all. And even if you do something like a household fixed effect, the relationship changes very little, which suggests that if there is selection into education, that's happening within the family. That this selection across families actually isn't important in driving the education mortality gradient. So that was a paper that sort of, I had this data on. This is using census restricted data. This data that linked people from born in the 1920s and 30s to mortality records from the Social Security office. And so this is pretty great data, and I basically the first research design just sort of totally stalled out, and so we sort of switched to sort of a different research design that isn't 100% a causal research design, but it still tells us something sort of that we think is really interesting.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My next question would be about the designing the program for a young researcher. So we know that many high school students and even undergraduate students want to do something impactful, some paper,
Yep.
that would bring some impact. So if you had a chance to design a kind of a program, training program for young researchers, what would you include in this program? Maybe some readings, mini projects, or some skills to develop, or anything else?
Yeah, I think there's sort of maybe well, more than there's I think three skills are sort of the most important. The first is like the most important thing is coming up with a good and interesting question. Uh, and that's really hard. It's especially hard to come up with a good and interesting question that no one's ever done before. I mean, I've had this happen to me many times, or happened to students many times, where they come up with something that's a really good question, really interesting, like a really good research idea that's already been done, or someone's done something sort of super similar. Um, and so it's really hard to come up with novel questions. And so I think that's sort of the most important part, novel questions that are interesting. The second is just technical skills. So you need to have the technical skills to work with data, to be able to get the right data sets. These technical skills, I think, is not just about programming in your estimators, or programming in your data manipulation in the right way. It's also about being proactive in finding the right data sources. So a lot of my best students have been really proactive at going to different say the education departments or different police departments, and just asking people for data. And so that's really important. I mean, you can go and use IPUM's data too. That's the public use census data in the United States. So you can go and use public records, but the this some of the best students are collecting data on their own, or going out and just finding data that's going to be useful for answering those questions. And then the last thing is just sort of, I think, I guess like a focus on like finishing up the project. And this is something where I struggle on too, is like you get really excited about a project and you get the data, and you go through the process of getting your first estimates, and they're interesting, and then you still have to like write up the paper, and then you have to submit the paper, and you have to respond to referees, and you have to deal with your paper is going to get rejected probably 3 or 4 times before it gets revised and resubmit somewhere. Like the whole publication process is really, it's a grind. It's definitely, for me, one of the most difficult parts of the whole process is like you get a paper, and then you want to sort of move on from that and do something else, but there's a whole nother process of cleaning up the paper, making it sort of as good as possible. And I think that's where I struggle, and I think that's where a lot of I see struggles in some of my students, not all of them. A lot of them are really good at that part too, of sort of like taking that final step.
Thanks a lot. So you actually pre-answered our next question about choosing a question for the research. But anyway, so we will end the part one with our last question. So big moves change lives, and based on your research, what practical advice, based on your research and your works and personal experience as well, what practical advice would you give a 20-year-old deciding whether to leave, say, home for opportunity?
That's a good question. What personal advice would I give to someone migrating? I would say any choice you make, especially a large choice like moving far away, is about trade-offs, right? So there's going to be benefits to new opportunities, and it's exciting to see new places, but of course you're also leaving things behind. So I guess this is more general advice about big choices that we make in life. There are never solutions. There's only trade-offs. And so, um, I don't think my research definitely shows that there's some negative impacts of migration. I don't want people to say like, oh, we shouldn't migrate because if we migrate, it's going to be maybe more stressful. We're breaking up social networks, and it turns out in two of the cases that we've studied, we see sort of negative impacts on mortality. I wouldn't say like, no, people shouldn't make these long distance migrations because of this research, right? But you should be aware of, that these, at least the migration episodes that we studied, and I guess we'll talk about more in a little bit, is it did increase mortality. The reason it increased mortality, I think, is because of, sort of maybe a lack of social networks, which led to higher stress and led to more unhealthy behaviors, like especially smoking and drinking. So I guess that's maybe something to be aware of if you're stressed, that you're not you're taking care of yourself as well. Um, so I guess that would be my general advice.
Thank you for your answer. That was pretty insightful. Um, so that was the last question of part one, and we would like to move to the part two. Uh, so here we would like to discuss the paper of yours, which is called The Long Run Health Consequences of Rural-Urban Migration. All right, so my question would be about these papers. So moving from rural areas to cities often raises income but changes daily life.
Yep.
So
Yep.
there is always a trade-off.
Yep.
In your data, which of these channels, for example, like air quality, stress, and access to care, looks most responsible for the long-run health consequences?
Yeah, so in this paper, we're studying people born in the Dakotas and Montana sort of between 1916 and I think 1932. So largely, this is a group of people that was very rural. Um, a large group grew up on farms, and they mostly moved to the West Coast. They didn't all move to urban areas, but the majority of them did. So think like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. And then, of course, they're not working in farming when you're moving to urban areas. So, we do find that migration has a negative impact on health. We don't have actually a causal, we don't have any causal data on causes of death, but what we do to try to find mechanisms for what could possibly be causing this, and you mentioned sort of several things, and I think it's all possible. So air quality is going to be worse in urban areas. So it's in a place like LA, there's a lot more air pollution than in rural North Dakota, and we know that air pollution is bad for health. It could also be, health behaviors. It could be stress. In terms of access to healthcare, my impression coming in is that access to healthcare would certainly be better in an urban area than it would be in rural Dakota. So that channel, I think would be working the other way. So what we think is that, so what we look at is cause of death for in a different data set where we look at people born in that time and the causes of death in places like Los Angeles and places like North Dakota. And what we find is that there's a lot more deaths due to things like COPD. So COPD is something related to smoking. And then we also have data on survey data on health behaviors, and see that people in urban areas during this time smoked a lot more, and especially women smoked a lot more. And so all of that is consistent with, I think what is happening is people move to urban areas. They had much higher incomes, so that was good. They had better access to healthcare, so that's good. But it seems like the overall impact on their health was negative, and probably the main channel is because they were smoking. And that's also, if you have a higher income, you can afford to spend more on cigarettes and alcohol and things like that. And so there's, I think probably it's a social thing, is that it was just more socially acceptable at the time for especially women to smoke in urban areas than it was in rural areas, or maybe especially in the Dakotas. Or it's, another thing that we can't rule out is it's something related to stress and the breaking up of social networks and moving to a new place. But I do think that sort of the number one mechanism is smoking.
Yeah, got it. So here's the follow-up. So we know that urban living increases the opportunities in general, but it can also increase the competition and stress. So how do you think about the health costs uh, you document relative to the potential gains in skills, network in urban areas? Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of like a cost benefit analysis, that's not something that we try to do, because it just, there's going to be so many benefits and costs of moving from a rural to an urban area that it's almost not possible to sort of put a dollar value. We can put a dollar value on mortality, and extra years of life expectancy. It's really hard, at least in this context, to sort of put a dollar value on like what are the amenities associated with rural and urban living. And that's, of course, going to be very dependent on the person. Some people are just going to prefer the urban lifestyle with, more restaurants and more, movie theaters, and you can, maybe walk to a grocery store or whatever. And then some people are going to prefer the rural lifestyle where it's not so busy and you can, get outside a lot more. So, we don't do anything like that, because I just think in this context it's sort of too hard. And as economists, we sort of think, at least our first instinct is sort of to think that the people moving do it because they think they're going to be better off where they're going. And so in terms of revealed preference, would say, these people are, at least on average, probably making good decisions. Now, they might not have the correct information about where they're going to, or they might have, wrong expectations about, how much they're going to like different areas. And so, that's not always going to be perfect. But, I think probably a lot of these people were better off moving to urban areas. And the reason I think that is because the majority of them didn't move back.
Thank you for your answer. Uh, okay. So regarding the jobs of migrants, so migrants often change jobs from for example, from agriculture to factory or service work, and it comes with difficult physical demands and schedules. So how much of the long run health effect seems tied to occupational shifts? And did you find certain industries that are especially protective or harmful for migrants?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this paper, we actually didn't have any data at all on occupation. So, I think that's still very much an open question. I think there is some, there's quite a bit of, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that, working in factories is bad for health. One thing we did find is that actually the impacts were larger for women than men. And so in that case, it definitely can't be all about sort of occupation because the majority of women moving to the West Coast are not working in factories. They're either not working at all or they're largely working in like the service industry or they're we know from other research that especially working in mines is really really dangerous, but that's not what these people are doing. And so I do, we do have some evidence that it's probably related to where you're working. So, another thing we do in this paper is we look at the marginal treatment effect of migration on different groups. And what we find is that, so for sort of higher ability men, people that are more likely to migrate, there's actually sort of no negative impact of migration. And these would be probably people working in like, professional jobs. So, maybe lawyers or doctors, things like that. It's really on the lower, sort of maybe lower skill men that you see more of a negative impact of migration. And so that doesn't definitely pin down that it's about what industry you work in, but I think it's suggestive. So, I think that'd be a pretty interesting thing to look at for future research is, and that definitely hasn't been pinned down, at least in this context, is, how much does, your occupation matter after you migrate for your long-term health? I think we have lots of good reasons to suspect that it does, that, working, especially during this time period, I think factories were much less safe than they are today. This is before OSHA, and so probably factories were more dangerous, and so worse for your long-term health.
Thank you for your answers. Really learned a lot, so thank you so much. So that's pretty much by me. We can go to another of your papers, which so far has questions.
Sure. Yeah. I guess let's go. So the impact of the Great Migration on mortality of African Americans, from evidence from Deep South. Sorry. So basically, I will briefly introduce the work and then we'll move to the questions. So this paper studies what the Great Migration meant for health and longevity among Black Americans born in the Deep South, so in the states of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South California, between 1916 and 1932. So the main result here was that those who left had higher old age mortality than similar people who stayed, likely tied to more smoking, drinking, and urban respiratory risks. Uh, to be more specific here, in instrumental variables estimates, movers were less likely to survive from age 65 to 70 by about 5 percentage points, and to 75 by roughly 10 points, 10 percentage points. So compared with stayers. So the ones who walked out, they were less healthy. Like they didn't live as much as those who stayed. So the work here, the interesting part is that the work flips an easy assumption that higher income up north and in western side of the US meant better health, and shows that big moves can bring health trade-offs even when economic gains are real. So for today's policy, I guess it's a reminder that mobility and opportunity need parallel investments in health behaviors.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
we can we can move to the question. So you study the Great Migration and old age health. So in one sentence, what economic question were you trying to answer, and why does it matter today?
So, I think it matters for a couple reasons. The first is, this was super important historical event in American history, and so we just want to understand, what were the impacts of this event. So that's sort of not about policy at all, and so maybe we can take those results and apply them to policy. But I think even absent policy impact, it's just important as an economic historian to understand what happened in the past better. For policy, I think you said sort of the perfect thing, which is that yes, this led to higher income, probably led to I would going into this paper, I just assumed that actually migrating north was going to be good for health. I was pretty shocked actually when we got the results and they were negative, because I just thought, well, of course it's going to be good for health. It's higher income. I assumed that hospitals in the urban north were probably better than the healthcare system in the rural south. Maybe that's not so true. I mean, all these people are at the age of 65, so they all would have been on Medicare. But still, I think that was a reasonable assumption. And what you said about parallel investments in health, I think is sort of the takeaway from this paper. It's not like, I don't think the takeaway should be people shouldn't migrate, because that I don't think that's a good policy. But we do need to be aware of these trade-offs and making whether it's investments in preventative care, investments in getting people not to smoke. It'd be interesting to see if you did this sort of similar paper today. I don't know that you would get the same results, just because people smoke a lot less than they did today than they did back in the 50s and 60s, especially in the United States. And so I think the research is really about understanding these trade-offs in migration, and it's also about understanding this one specific historical event.
Thanks a lot. So my next question would be about migrants. So many migrants earn more up north, yet find higher mortality rate. So in economic terms, how do you weigh higher wages and opportunity against the long run health costs of moving?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of a couple ways to think about this question. Like, the first is, we know from other research, there's like trade-offs between income and health. So like, people are willing to work a more dangerous job for higher pay. And that's something we call like compensating differentials. I don't think that's actually the right context. That's not the right way to think about this one, because I don't think when people made this move, they had any idea or were thinking at all about what this is going to do to my long-term health. I just don't think, because like, how could they have known? Like, we didn't know, right? Going into this, they weren't thinking about that at all. I don't think. I've never heard in any historical reading someone thinking about this trade-off in the way that someone thinking about like a compensating differential would be. They were moving for lots of reasons, economic reasons. They were moving because of Jim Crow laws and oppression in the South. And so in terms of like, were people better off after making the move? I don't think we can say. I think we can say that probably a lot of people were better off, and maybe some people weren't better off. It's just, I don't think that we can answer that question.
Got it. Yeah. So my next question is pretty interesting, I would say. So, uh, do your results suggest that the Great Migration was an intergenerational migrant? So, first generation migrants paid a hidden house cost to their kids, so that their kids gained education and earnings and higher earnings. And if we priced both sides in dollars, let's say, Does that bargain still come out positive? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. Me and some other people have thought about like, and wanted to know sort of what were the health impacts on the children. It turns out that's a really hard question to answer. So we sort of haven't gone down that research path, at least not yet. Maybe future data will come out and that'll be easier to answer. But yeah, in terms of economic opportunity, it's definitely clear that there are more economic opportunities for children in the North than in the South, and that the kids grew up to have higher levels of education, higher income. There definitely were this intergenerational aspect, and I do think that when people were making this move, they were thinking about that for sure. Is that they were thinking this is not going to be just a better life for me, but it's also going to be a better life for my children. So, but the answer is like we don't know what if there was a positive or negative impact on the health of children. We haven't been able to answer that question yet. But I do think we know, or at least we're pretty sure that this had a positive impact on like the income of the children and the educational attainment of the children.
Thanks a lot. So my last question wouldn't be that much work related, like this research work related, but overall economics related. So if you could flip one city factor, let's say air quality, housing crowding, factory exposure, cigarette access, which change would you most likely uh, er- erase? Which change would most likely erase the mortality gap your study finds?
So I think it's hard to know for sure. Probably it's smoking, because smoking is just so bad for health. That smoking is sort of one of the worst things you can possibly do for your health. So probably that's the number one factor. But that's again very context dependent. So if you were going to study like a migration episode in a country that had really low smoking rates, um, you wouldn't maybe find this result, or maybe you'd find a much smaller result. Um, and so, yeah, but here probably it's smoking. I mean, it's really hard to sort of pin down 100%. We don't really have the best methods for separately identifying the impacts of like air quality and housing quality and the impacts of your job on mortality. But it's my guess that smoking is really the worst thing.
Got it. Thanks a lot. That's basically the end of the formal part of the podcast. So we had a couple of questions to like make our work better. I would say like the feedback part. How was it? What did you like? What did you dislike about the podcast overall? About the structure? About like preparation stuff? And what would you suggest to improve? We are completely open to criticism and you may like say
Yeah.
confident to
Like, I thought it was excellent. Like, I thought your questions were really just you clearly prepped very well. I think you asked like the perfect questions. Yeah, I really enjoyed being on the podcast a lot. I'll if you want to ask some other people, I can give you some recommendations, and I'll recommend them to you. But yeah, no, overall, yeah, I had a really great time. Thank you.
Yep, that would be great. So I guess we'll keep in touch with you and
Yeah.
your Professor Taylor Evan. Yep,
Yeah.
sure. So
That's,
by us, it was great, honestly. Like that positive vibe, everything. I liked it a lot, honestly.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
really also learned a lot of insights for me personally. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for one thing is you keep hearing a lot of background noise, um, wherever you are. So Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, overall, yeah, I had a really excellent time. Best of luck, with your podcast and going forward.